Hey everyone, this time we read Story Mode by Trevor Strunk. I did not like this book very much. It's nothing wrong with the way that it was written, nothing wrong with the subject. I found it interesting at some points, but there were just a bunch of weird historical inaccuracies in it that kind of pulled me out of the book for a little bit. Also, I just didn't really agree with him on a few points. Even if I thought, he does say some stuff that's very interesting. I think a lot of the arguments in there make sense. I just didn't necessarily agree with him on a lot of the things that he was pointing out. Now, most people probably aren't going to care about the historical inaccuracies in this, and it's fine. I mean, I was reading it from the perspective of a historian. So if you read this as like a cultural study, which I think is the way he intends you to read it, it makes more sense. And that stuff, like basically any of the issues that I have with it in that case, can just sort of be passed over because they're really just not that important to what Trevor's trying to get across to the reader. So I'm probably not the intended audience for this one, which is fair. I don't need to be the intended audience for it. So, yeah, it was just. It was one of those times where I read a book and I wanted to like it, but there were just some weird things in it that made me not like what was going on. And yeah, it had nothing to do with the content of the book. For the most part, there are a few issues that I had with it, but yeah, I guess I'm just saying I just really just didn't like the book that much. He also talks about the FPS genre, and he also compares Fallout with Shin Megami Tensei. These were where I had some more issues, just with the way he talked about them. Probably not the ones that most people are thinking about, but it's where some of the historical stuff comes up. With the FPS genre, I think it was a little bit more glaring with the things that he was getting wrong. With Shin Megami, it was I think it was kind of nitpicking. It's just it had to do with the origin of the series and whatnot, and just me looking at it and wondering if certain things were actually canon of the series. The one on Shin Megami, that was, you can take that one or leave it. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Fair enough. The stuff on the FPS genre that he brought up that was wildly inaccurate. That was something that really made me question what was going on with this. So the thing that bothered me with the FPS genre, for the most part, I didn't have a huge problem. I think he is correct when he talks about uh, its influence on culture and everything, because he's not talking just about gaming culture. He's talking about culture at large, and I didn't really have a huge problem with it. It's more of just it's kind of one of those things where I would need to see more than what he presents in this book to kind of agree with him. At this point, I'm not really totally on board with him. I would just need to see more data on that. He presents his argument in a very compelling way, which it made me think about it at least. So there is that. The thing that really bugged me though was when he was talking about Doom, and he gets to a part on Daikatana, and everything he said in that was just wrong and weird. Like, I don't understand why and it wouldn't have been as bad as if he hadn't put another statement beforehand. It was just very strange. He talks about how Masters of Doom is required reading. I believe he read the book, but I don't think he read it recently, because he gets to a section on Daikatana and he talks about how Daikatana affected id Software and affected the Doom series, which doesn't make any goddamn sense to me because Daikatana was not made by Doom. It was made by Ion Storm. While it was made by John Romero, it was made after John Romero had left id, and that story was very well covered. Well, it was very well covered in a few David Craddock books. It was it was covered in Masters of Doom, but not as well as what David Craddock does. John Romero left id, founded Ion Storm with Tom Hall, and then started working on Daikatana. The marketing did not help Daikatana very much, but also the fact that it's not really the same first-person shooter that Doom was. It's more of an RPG. It's in a very different genre than the first-person shooter, and it's just very strange to hear that thing talk, to hear it mentioned on how Daikatana brought Doom down, and that just made absolutely no sense to me. That was the only thing that I read in that concerning Doom that just made me very confused. He also talks about Spec Ops: The Line, and I have no problems with what he says about Spec Ops: The Line. I completely agree with him on that. The only thing that bugged me was when he said Rockstar published it, which isn't true. It was published by 2K Software. Or sorry, just 2K Games. Sorry. My fault on misspeaking there. It was published by 2K, who owns Rockstar, but it wasn't published by Rockstar. If you just Google the game, you don't see the Rockstar label on it at all. It's the 2K Games label, so that was kind of weird to me when he talked about that, because it was just one of those instances where what he said wasn't true. And you could have easily figured that part out. But wrapped around it is all this other stuff that I kind of agreed with for the most part. There were some parts where I was kind of iffy on. But it was just strange when I read stuff like that. And again, it's, as I mentioned before, it's probably because I wasn't reading this in the right mindset. I was reading it more as a history book instead of a cultural studies book. So just two more things when it comes to weird stuff that was in this. When he talks about Shin Megami Tensei, he talks about how it started in 1992. And, fair enough, that's when it started being called Shin Megami Tensei. I had to go and look, and because it didn't sound right to me. Because there are two games that come before Shin Megami Tensei. There's Megami Tensei 1 and 2 on the Famicom. And I wasn't too sure if those were part of the same series or not, or if that was like the official beginning of the series. I don't think they're connected. Well, they're definitely not connected story-wise, but if you're talking about where the series started, I would argue that it started back in the late 80s with Megami Tensei, not the series beginning with Shin Megami Tensei. And this is a case where, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Fair enough. I'll admit, I'm wrong on that one. But it just doesn't... That one just didn't feel right when he said that, because I was like, well, I don't think that's 100% true. It seemed a little weird to me. And then when he talks about JRPGs, this is just something that annoys me whenever I read about them and people place the origin with Dragon Quest, which isn't true at all. There were JRPGs before Dragon Quest. There weren't many of them, but there were JRPGs before that. He doesn't mention Black Onyx, which I feel is a game that just kind of gets ignored. But I don't know how you can ignore the game that is a JRPG. It was made by a Japanese company. Granted, it was run by an American. But it was made in Japan. It's an RPG. It's technically a JRPG. I think there are two others that came before it, but Black Onyx is what kind of started the ball rolling for other companies. And you can see that Dragon Quest was inspired by Black Onyx. And he doesn't really mention that. And he also mentions some weird stuff with the series and everything. And just how Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest were, yeah, that whole section that he wrote on that, just, it really didn't make any sense. And that was when I was kind of thinking, maybe maybe I'm just not reading this correctly. And I had to go back and look again. And yeah, I don't think Trevor got a lot of that right at all. Okay, that's all the crap that I didn't necessarily like about the book or was giving me issues with it. I don't want to be too mean to it or be too negative about this book, because I actually did like a lot of it. There wasn't too much that I disliked, and I know I rambled on about a bunch of stuff I didn't like, but it's still pretty minor. Unless you're like really into video games, you're probably not going to care about any of the stuff I mentioned, and it's probably not going to bother you too much when you read this. From here, it goes into some stuff that I do like and I did enjoy about the book, especially his talk about, his comparison of Fallout and Shin Megami Tensei. I really enjoyed that talk after I got over all the weirdness that I mentioned earlier. I thought his discussion on that is really good, because it talks about the two different ways that the apocalypse is looked at. It was just a very good conversation. I really liked that part of the book. So while I was reading this, I kept thinking about, you have the American view of the apocalypse, and you have sort of people trying to return to what things used to be. And that's kind of a very American way to look at things. Like, we can always make things better, or at least we believe we can always make things better. And then you can question whether or not we actually pulled that off, and that's, you can make up your own mind on that one. And then you have the Japanese view of the apocalypse, where this is the way things are now. The past is over, we kind of move on from that and into something new. And you talk about the different ways people are dealing with the apocalypse, where, in Fallout you're trying to reestablish some sort of order, and you can kind of say that if you go for like the good endings or something like that with Shin Megami. I think you're still trying to restore a semblance of order, but it's not going to be the way things were in the past. It was a very cool way to look at it, and that was one of the parts in the book that kind of made me think, and I started agreeing with Trevor more when I was reading through that part of the book. One weird thing about that chapter, though, is it was weird how he kind of didn't want to bring up the cultural differences between like an American RPG and the Japanese RPG. I felt like that should have been brought up more, and maybe that was just me misreading what he had wrote. But that was kind of at the core of this whole thing. You have different cultures that tell stories in different ways. Not necessarily a historical retelling of something, because that's obviously going to be different depending on which side of the event that you're looking at. But having two people tell the same type of a story, how the world ends, and what happens to society as the world is ending, that's very much a great story that can be told, and you're going to get different cultural perspectives on it. It's similar to looking at like the way movies are made, and you have different ways in which people tell stories. I can't remember the documentary I watched, but you have the American way of telling stories, where we like things ending with a happy ending. And then you have other countries where sometimes stories don't end that way, because not every story can have a happy ending to it. I just wish he had done more with that. There were so many times reading this where I would go through one of the chapters and think to myself, this should have been the whole book. This should not have just been one chapter. Like, I wish he had done more with this. That kept on coming up as I was reading this. So, well, overall, I didn't really like the book. I liked parts of it, and I think there was a lot of good stuff in here. I just didn't necessarily like how it was presented. I didn't like some of the historical inaccuracies in it, and I just didn't feel like certain things. There were some things that I thought didn't need to be in the book at all, and there were some other things where I was like, "This needs to be the entire book." Uh, yeah, it was just very. It was one of those books where I was really torn on it, whether I actually was enjoying myself while I was reading this, or if I was really willing to finish the damn thing. Uh, but that being said, I think there's some good stuff in here, but I can't really recommend this to people. So anyway, guys, that's gonna wrap it up. Please let me know what you think in the comments below, and have a great day, everybody.